All right, welcome. We're in our fourth session. You can see that with these blue dots at the top. On the right-hand side, you can click here and zero in. The next three sessions, today and the next two, are covering the whole get set portion of this curriculum. So today we're talking about change theory and building power. Next week we're going to talk about the walking tour, doing research, and also throw in group dynamics. And then we'll finish this out with strategy and tactics. So that's kind of the flow. We put a template for planning your course. It overlaps with the reflection questions that Scott's posed in the book and that we've been talking through. It's a place to put your notes on how the actual class will run. So there's the assignment. The students have to prepare for that class. There won't be something due every class, but so you would delete that in the template. I just left it there so you knew it was there. And then there's notes on the presentation and discussion, the flow of that session, and then any additional notes on the exercises or group work that you're going to set aside. And in Scott's way of doing it, there's a lot of group work in every class, practically. If you go to the webinar link here, I've added this to the webinar material. And I added it below the book, chapters. There's the course reflection questions that are part of the book, and then it's right here. It covers the typical things at the top end of a syllabus. You may have a different structure. Of course, use your own structure, but the goal here is to have something that folks would fill in. What we're looking at is people to use this template to begin to show to us and show to yourself how you're actually going to run the sessions, not just what the readings are, but actually how you're going to facilitate that content and the work of your groups. The template has date, theme, class number, assignment, and has the book, the read, or the do without any content in it. So we're not pre-populating it, but we're giving people a basic template. And the goal would be for the next session for you to maybe do the first 4 classes, and maybe you do the first 5 or 6, but cover up today's class, if not even get some of today's class thought through. This is the kind of thing we'll try to collect at the end of the whole webinar series, which actually is not until January, so there's plenty of time to work on it. The reflection questions are broad, but where might you put the answers in a more practical way that you can use? And so we're thinking this idea of the assignment, the notes on the presentation, how you're going to flow, how that'll flow, and then the exercise work. What I did here is I literally just took stuff from the book and put in what Scott said he was doing in that class. The expectation is not that you will keep up with everything, given everything else that's going on. And there's a big chunk of time before the very last session where you will a little bit of pull your material together and sort of present back out what your game plan is. The goal right now here, just with this assignment stuff, is document as much as you've got planned, and then email that to Scott, and Scott will give you the real feedback. But I kind of want to see it too, frankly. And then we'll use that in the next session as the opening. Reflect a little bit on what we saw and that kind of thing. Scott, do you want to add to that a little bit?
The one thing I have to say about the notes on presentation discussion, like how I'm doing it, but it's not saying how you're doing it, right? You'll do it your way. You at least know what at least one other social action course is doing. And then dependent on your answers on part D and E, you will change it and you will make it, you might include, for example, other social theory that I didn't talk about, maybe even more is applicable to your discipline. So really that's just to kind of be a reminder for you to say, at least this is at least one model, and then you're going to add to it and make it. Because I just think like faculty and staff, we want to make sure we have our implant onto what we're doing. And I totally agree. And I feel that way too. So it's helpful, but it's not the only way for sure to do it. And so take it for, hopefully there can be some useful things, but you'll add things to it and we'll all learn from that as well.
Great. So let me just point out a couple other things real quickly. One is that I've been posting the highlight video. I actually have next week's already posted. I was very proud of myself. I got that done. They take a little bit while to do because you're looking at an hour, 15-minute session, but I actually think the end, they're just fantastic. It's just my personal view, and they complement the book almost word for word in some cases, but they're a nice complement. I just have it up here. One of the things I added to the material here, the recording, is I have a timestamp to tell you what content was covered. and I've got the little like a PowerPoint, a little slide that tells you this title. So it just gives you the flow if you want to go to somewhere in particular afterwards, where to find it. The other thing I think it'd actually be interesting, Scott, just because Susan's still here.
Mhm.
You might have seen Scott put out on the platform that one of the campaigns had a big event, and it was this one here. And when you go to your mural, you can double click on these, and you can actually go to. In this case, we have this flyer posted on the Bonner website as one of the resources. So the event from yesterday at noon, West Coast time, was this big press conference, and there's just two of the articles that came out in the paper. And this is a campaign that the original campaign lasted, I think, 2 years. That meant at the end of each semester, the campaign book was put together. The next semester, some of those students came back and presented it to the next new group to say, we'd love you to pick up the campaign. And every semester for those 2 years, the next group did pick it up from scratch. I mean, there's a great campaign, but they had to go through the same exercises, maybe refining the earlier stuff until they finally won. This is one of those campaigns where you might win, but then you have to make sure they actually do what they say they're going to do. And so this new campaign is to basically to get the school has to do better. They've committed certain things they would do, and they haven't done that well. So here's the press conference. Here's the students with their posters. There's a whole article. There's a couple other photographs in this one. And the Bill Wilson Center, I think, is a center. Is that for
Homeless youth?
Homeless youth.
And they're the ones there. So let me tell you so many interesting things about this that'll be helpful for you. So go back to the flyer, Bobby.
Yeah.
So that was a flyer. Students totally designed the whole flyer. I didn't see it till it was already done. They knew they had to do a flyer. We talked about it. So that was a student who is one that's not a talker, but can contribute, right? Contributed his skills to creating this amazing flyer. So that's an example of like everyone can contribute, right? And so go back to the flyer.
Yeah.
You look at that flyer. The only thing that I helped the students on in that flyer was the language of SJSU has to do better, because that had to do with tone. And they wanted to, like, what tone should we bring? So there was an hour-long brainstorming with the students about, because we have a president who's on her way out. She's resigned because she didn't respond to sexual harassment and sexual assault on our campus. 23 students had been sexually assaulted in the sports program, swimmers. She didn't respond decisively, and it's a long story, but she was asked to resign by the chancellor, so she's out. So we just have a very small window before she leaves on the 15th to try to get this agreement right, because that's who they've been negotiating with for the last 2 years. So they didn't want to be too critical. So like, instead of saying administration is saying something totally negative, they put it in the positive, has to do better. So that came out of a brainstorming with me. So that's the only thing. So I'm giving you an example of like my role, because I'm actually their faculty advisor with that group. My role in that group was they do it all, but I kind of said, if you thought about how to talk more about the tone, so that's the president. So now let's go to the next slide. So let's go back to this. Just go to the original picture of that.
Yeah.
Go back up. Why that image is so interesting, because it's so much about, we're talking about, so the group talks about, and in that dynamic, so we're going to talk about power with, power over, power for. The language they were talking about it to the press was, we want a relationship with the administration that is power with, not power over. So here they're using the book language when they're talking to the media and to the public about what kind of relationship they want, because it's been power over in their relationship as they sit on the advisory council. They're told what to do. When they have ideas, they're not listened to, and they're basically being dominated. So they're using the language that we're talking around power and saying, we want power, but we want a certain type of power. So that's interesting. Here's another really interesting thing. We talk about building campus allies today. That person there on the right is Sparky Harland. So the woman on the right is Sparky. She's the head of the Bill Wilson Center for Homeless Youth. She's the CEO. She's the one that works in collaboration with the university to provide services. She's the one that called out the university and said they're not doing right by the students, because the students say it, they aren't believe, but here is an ally right with them saying the university is not, they're doing things that make it impossible for students to get the help they need by creating barriers like maximizing student loans. So super important to have an ally, and they've developed that ally with them. She also sits on the advisory council with the students. And so it's kind of like having that person that you were talking about building power. You have to have allies. So I want to say a little about Lana. Here's a student 2 years ago that could not speak publicly, could not do it, so nervous. And here she is now as the president leading that and did an unbelievable job. The gal on if you go to the picture of the gal in the pink right, there she is. No, the other picture. There she is on the second to the right student. She's a student that is it was her first time ever speaking publicly. She says, I have social anxiety. I'm so nervous. I'm not sure I can even do it. And she did it. And we had a talk today. She's doing another interview today on the radio. So it's like, I said, look, Lana was just like you, and you're going to develop your power, and today's going to be a little bit better than yesterday. I guarantee it. You're going to feel even more comfortable. And I kind of guided her and prepped her. So you got to do that kind of prepping to help your students, because they get really nervous. Here's a student, this student right here, she's joined Shaw, and I'm recruiting her to take the class next semester. So hopefully she's going to be in the class. The last picture, by the way, of Buster Posey, the last picture was of another ally. If you go back, is that was a Mercury News piece. It's that piece. Just look at that. That is Pastor Scott Wagers. He was a student at San Jose State. He's actually the founder of 1992 of the Student Homeless Alliance. He's now a minister in our community, and he spoke out in support of the students. Again, building, those allies that you need in the community to deal here with particularly a campus issue. So that's an introduction into today, but I think it's hopefully helpful to you all. Any thoughts or questions about that? By the way, that's in the San Jose Mercury News, the biggest newspaper in Silicon Valley.
My main comment is it looks so impressive and big, and it's almost intimidating that would happen. And if it was students on their own, intimidating maybe as a faculty member. You've done it so often, it's not intimidating to you anymore, but that much press, that much pressure on the school, that big a thing happening. This isn't your first lap around, but looking back, maybe when you had the first big thing that happened, big campaign, were you a little nervous too back then?
Always. Yeah, I was nervous. I would say this, and what I have done is I was trying to figure out my role in all this. And my role is really just, I was there in all the pre-work to help them, because like they wrote their speeches. So they wanted to talk about them. And so I helped them, like, if you thought about this, about that. So it's kind of like you're doing the work that you normally would do for a university or for grading, but I'm doing it on the backside with the students. So I'm nervous. I'll tell you this time, I was a bit more nervous because I know all the administrators now. I know how uncomfortable this is going to make them feel. And so that part's a little harder. When I first started, I didn't really know who the president was or the provost. But now, since I've done it so many times, I know them. And I was actually in communication all throughout the last 2 days with the provost, who's a supporter of the students, trying to get him to get the president to do the right thing. So it's a different role that you play as the students are doing it. But yeah, I think you're always a little bit nervous because you don't want, I'm sure you all love your institutions. I love my institution. I don't want to make it look so bad, but I also we want to support the students in their demands and the cries for justice. So, and it's exhilarating to see the response of the students. I can't tell you how powerful that was. By the way, that student group is 5 students. So they look bigger because several of the other students are from other of the campaigns that went and held stuff for them. So it's much bigger. It looks bigger, but they really have four social action students in this semester and one that was in a year ago. And by the way, Alinsky would say this: it's not how powerful you are, it's how powerful you seem. And if you can generate this much energy, you in the front page of the San Jose Mercury News, as well as KQED, which is the National Public Radio, over 1 million listeners, that's a lot of power. So you have to, I tell you have to wield the power responsively. Like, one of the things the university is just lying. They're not telling the truth right now. So I'm advising students, don't call them liars. Just call them, they're not being forthright. So it's like how to try to manage that and try to get the best result.
So I have one more question. What number week is this for you, for your class?
Okay, so we are in week. Let me go over my thing because I have it. I actually put the day of the classes on every day for my students. So we're in day 22 right now. So that's like week 11. So which is right at the time of launching their campaigns. And let me say about launching your campaigns, because go back to that thing about launching campaigns.
Yeah, but I just want to look at here for a second. So these are weeks.
Yeah.
If you do 2 classes a week, you're right here.
So no campaign is launched. This was kind of a campaign launch, even though it's a campaign that's been going on for most of those students, where they did a kind of a coming out to the press. So for very much a campaign launch. And what that did, as they were doing the preparation the last 2 weeks for this, all the other campaigns were like, we can do it too. We're going to do it. And it motivated them. And I guarantee with this much press, they're going to even be more excited because they want to see, they're on TV, they're all covered by 3 TV stations. They want to see themselves on TV, and they like to see that. So there's this buzz that happens in the classroom, and that's occurring now. Right now, there's this buzz. And I would say this, up until really week 9, the buzz, I call it the COVID buzz, it was kind of no energy. Like you talked to this, there was very little energy in those first 5 weeks. And I call it the COVID buzz, but now it's been transformed and the students are super energized because they're going to be launching we have like 2 or 3 more campaign launches in the next 2 weeks. And they have a specific example now.
Nice. Questions, thoughts from anybody? There's a couple in the chat.
You all
Great
like
examples. Yeah.
Any questions or thoughts?
The physical setting is impressive.
The physical setting.
Yes, you have the protest in the background from the Summer Olympics.
Yeah, and notice that they put also Smith Carlos on their banner.
Yes.
So it's there, it's behind them. So that racial social justice is part of that, and it's deliberate, right? We want it to be deliberate, and that's a deliberate statement. Like, you got to act, right? You can't it's not just to be competitive, you have to act. So there they are, Smith Carlos. So they can't really say, hey, you shouldn't be doing this, students, because they honor Smith Carlos.
Every campus should have a statue of some activist who did something big.
That's right.
To lean on, because all the press conferences are here, just about, right? This is the standard location.
Most everyone's right there.
We have the Cesar Chavez Memorial too at San Jose State.
Yeah.
And we've done a few over there, Steve. We've done a few. In fact, if you go through the photos of the tabling, which is part of today's dialogue about building power, do you want to click on that, Bobby?
Yeah.
Of the photos of tabling, which is like, how do you get power? Like, after you go through the definitions of power and the concepts of power, then it's like, how do I get it? And one of them is to build your base. So these are all examples of the students for DMH. That's Shaw. So you got to build your base, right? These are all examples. And one of them, you go through it, that's CAN. You're going to see that Students Against Mass Incarceration. They're out there.
There it is.
This one is the one with Cesar Chavez. So they were right in front. Education is a right. And they were, and I don't know if you see that. Can you see? They're actually, it's theatrical. They're chained down by the kind of the shackles of, I think this was on tuition.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah, so they were wearing chains. So if you have these high tuitions, and they were actually advocating for free tuition, you become liberated. So they put a theatrical piece to that. So that's the Cesar Chavez statue on our campus, which is about 100 yards from the Smith Carlos. But here's the thing: for some reason, it's harder to get energy right in that space. It's easier in the Smith Carlos because people are walking by so much. Maybe, I don't know.
Nice.
But public space is important. And that's why that walking tour is important, and kind of like claim a space.
We have a couple of links for you guys to this section of our website. The readings from the book, both the teaching guide as well as the student guide, are in here. It's not wholly comprehensive yet, but we're getting there. And then examples of flyers. There's a whole bunch of those.
And those are all student made. Like I have one, I can't even make a flyer. I'm terrible at that kind of stuff. So those are all student created.
And I can vouch for that.
That's right.
And then
Totally.
a lot of those videos, different videos you might want to show in your class, are also all collected in one spot.
And I would say this about all those things is that those are examples. You please use them if they're helpful, but I really see them being then taken down or added to in your class. You'll be like the student readings, the reflections. As you go through it, you'll have your own student reflections. You'll have your own your videos to show. You'll have your own flyers. But in the meantime, at least you have some examples, and you have some examples from the reading of campaigns that have been successful that you can have your students read. But eventually, those will be replaced by your work.
Yep. So wonderful. So let me just, for those who came a little late, let me just mention a couple things. This is our schedule, and you can see that in a couple different places. But this whole sequence here is that middle getting set, right before the launch, after they've chosen their campaigns. So they've gone, and now they're doing the getting set part. This part right here, there's the link now. I sent it on an email. It's on our resources for the webinar page as well. This is a Word document that's a combination of a syllabus template. You all have your own syllabus templates, but just some generic stuff there. But really the key of it is for each class, there's a basic set of questions, which is the date, the theme, the class number, the assignment. You're going to have, in this case, book reader, if anything's due that class. And then this is the important part, notes on your presentation and discussion, how you're going to run that class. And then any additional notes on the exercises or group work that you're organizing. The goal here is to have something that you can use to take what you're learning and put it in some initial structure, but also that you would share that draft as we go along. We're going to ask you to send it to us at least next week and maybe a couple more times before we break for the holiday. So Scott in particular, me because I'm curious, Scott because he actually gave you good feedback on, well, how are you thinking about structuring your class? And since some of these classes are going to be overlapping with the theme of climate change or some other topic, there'll clearly be other things that will be woven into your curriculum. The curriculum we're talking about with Scott really focuses on primarily the first 9 weeks, first 18 classes roughly, and then that ending class. So having a document like this that you can develop and then share will really be helpful for feedback purposes and hopefully for your own purposes as well. I just filled in this one based on what's in Scott's book. You'll have an empty one, just bullet points and empty assignments. So look for that, and if you have any questions about it, I can send it to you, and we'll send a reminder out early next week, and hope everybody who's developing the material can forward their drafts, work in progress, to us before next Friday. Okay, so what we thought we would do is have some discussion around these set of questions. We simplified the questions that are in the reader, or in the teaching guide, because we're a small enough group. We'll just do it here together and not break into smaller groups. Scott, why don't you frame this a little bit?
Yeah, so I come out of a sociology background, obviously. So mine are around these foundational folks, Marx and Weber. But as I said in that video, is that my experience with it is that students really aren't thrilled to talk about theory sometimes. So I tried to frame it in a kind of an easy way for them, but a new way for them to think about it, kind of a materialism and ideationalistic factors. So, but it's still talking kind of at the heart of kind of what drives change. So there's this macro social change theory I want them to know about and to be grounded in. And then I want them to know something about community change. And just so I'm unique in that, if you read every other book kind of about social change, they'll start with Saul Alinsky, but I decided to kind of bring an intersectionalist perspective to it. So I started with women and Black women and white women and their work in community change, and then went to Saul Alinsky and then all the things, because then a lot of times they don't talk about the adaptations to the Alinsky model. So I highlighted those for people. So I think it's a question for you to think is, do you want to do that? Do you want to teach about theory? And if you want to, will you want to use this, what I'm doing, or do you want to adapt it? Or do you want to do something else? And so it's really for you to kind of, with your colleagues and peers, to have that conversation about what kind of theory do you want to have the students know when they're doing change.
So who's been able to give this a little bit of thought? How they might go about this? And who, maybe some of you have already taught some of these, not in the sense of getting students ready for campaigns, but taught some of these larger concepts already.
I think I've been thinking about this a lot of just how we have learning outcomes. We're not really teaching a course, but we're facilitating activities, and like through the scholars programs, we have definitive learning outcomes that we want for our students and the ways that they look at communities and look at kind of social challenges and the perspective they take. I really appreciate the feminist lens run. I actually originally learned about service and social innovation as an undergrad using bell hooks. So like that's something that I super agree with. But I think I've been thinking just a lot about how to remove jargon, but talk about having like a systems lens and an asset-based perspective when looking at communities, especially I think a little different from San Jose State. Most students at Widener are not from Chester. They're from like the Northeast. So there's a bit of like similarity and background there, but they're coming to a new community and oftentimes they leave Chester after graduation. So in terms of what they create or implement, it's also like they have to be very intentional and thoughtful about those partnerships because they're not in this space or this geographic location for a long time. So I've been thinking a lot about like, how can you incorporate experiential learning in an ethical way with those dynamics, but also removing jargon from explaining that theory and those philosophies as well.
Do you feel like there's jargon in there in what I've written, or because I try to not speak in jargon?
No, I agree. Like I've really appreciated reading everything because I think it's one of the first like academically sourced community change education pieces I've read that doesn't use jargon. I think sometimes with like sourcing material, even sometimes I like a lot of the students I work with, I'm only like a year older than. So there's an element of like, I use pop culture a lot when I talk to my students. So like we talked about subject relationships and High School Musical, like the first week that we started. So like there's some things that I use that I think are as like learning tools, but those are not going to be tools forever, or I don't know, there's like an element of similarity there with me and my students. But yeah, I don't think that what you've written is filled with jargon.
I'm told not. So I've tried to remove that, right? I do want to say about bell hooks, because I was trained in the late 1980s by an ecofeminist by the name Gaia Micah. She had us read bell hooks and Home Place is a Site of Resistance. And I never forgot that piece. And so that became like centerfold to start with when we started talking about community engagement, that Home Place can be one of those places as a site of resistance, in addition to schools, right? It's like, where are places that we usually don't think about as the places of resistance? So I'm glad you picked up on the bell hooks piece, because she was foundational in my thinking years ago and when I was young, when I was your age.
Karen, any thoughts on this? Or Rosa,
I'm
you
I-
ready?
Oh,
Yeah, go
go
ahead,
ahead.
either one.
Yeah, so just kind of what comes to mind, what came to mind from the reading is in terms of our work in California Youth Leadership Corps, we're really trying to think of creating a new model. So
It's up the
I-
steps
I think it takes
on the right.
Go ahead. I'm going to shut. Can you silence him?
So I think that we're taking aspects of different models. I don't think we fit into either the Saul Alinsky or the feminist-based model. I think we're creating something new. We're taking aspects of those. We are working with community college students, and our work is really grounded. Those issues are grounded in the community, the internship sites that students are going to be working at with those social justice organizations. And we really like to think that our students actually come from those communities. So that's a value that we take very seriously. It's not folks coming in from another, like the Saul Alinsky model, where you have organizers coming in from somewhere else to organize a community that they're not really familiar with. But things that come up are like, in terms of the skill sets, bringing people together, power mapping, researching the skills to come up with a really good, not just using slogans, campaign slogans, but like a real issue, and making sure that issue is something that's doable, that's measurable. So some of those pieces really stuck. Really, those are ones that I thought about as I did the reading.
Yeah.
Mhm. I want to address that on the Alinsky point, because first of all, my students, when they read the two models, and I say we need to integrate them at the end of the book, you see them, and more. But I think because they really have a hard time with kind of the masculine 24/7 outside leadership. But I also tell them, I was like, look, at Alinsky model has evolved. I mean, like as it's gone through its reiterations, people have said, what, let's deal with the issue of like no women. There's got to be more women involved in this, and we can't have those expectations. And then also we can be leaders too. It doesn't have just to be the union boss or whoever. Like we can also. So I try to point that out. It's evolving, and that Alinsky was one model, but people have taken it, and there's been these critiques. Like C2 is an example of that. Center for Third World Organizing, which is like, we need to have it based in racial justice has to be primary. Right. So it's a great, I think it's important to know about that model, but also to critique it, and also to appreciate its strengths and its weaknesses, right? So it's like, so I think at least get them to because I want them to have that part of Alinsky, which is we have to be powerful.
Right.
We have to have power. We have to confront power. So I want that part for sure in there. But I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I think that's the kind of fun part, is like the multi-layered part of that Alinsky story.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely, thank you.
Karen?
Yeah, I think when I was reading, some of the thoughts that were going through my head were, as a former English teacher and teaching works of literature, and thinking about Richard Wright's quote about all literature is protest, and how I got kids to identify what was being protested in a particular piece of literature, and to have them either connect to the text to self or text to the world. And maybe this is getting too theoretical to think about. I had to think about how kids saw the world, whether inductively or deductively. And so different approaches seem better for different kids. And so when you think about how you were introducing, maybe starting with self change and then moving to community change, and then looking at a macro level, or starting with macro level, but first they have to be able to feel it in themselves. Like, is there a time when you felt like you didn't have power, or you were discriminated against? And then how can we use that so that you understand more about macro?
Well, for sure, what I think is interesting is like to teach those flipped, right? The theoretical, but for sure they've already been asked that. If you look at the Change book, like in chapter 2, like on literally like the second and third day of class, I asked those questions, like, how have you been experienced where there's been marginalization, like, and to get them to connect. So I totally agree with you, but I think interestingly, theoretically, like you could flip those, right? And start with the school, as a place of resistance and their relationship to school or to their family, and then go community, which is a fun way to do it too. I think either way, I'm a sociologist, probably that's my problem. So macro, just like people, as you go down that list, my colleagues get more nervous about me being in their department because the community change is really not even talked about within sociology. That's like, do that in education leadership or something. Don't, why us? That's too micro. Interesting, right?
Yeah.
I did want to highlight one thing on the class 5 and 6. This is on page 23. This is very practical, by the way. We're having fun on the conceptual, which is important, but the practical, which is like when I have that class 5, they've just basically said their demand, and then they've got a target roughly. They might even not have the right target, but they have a target, but it might not be the right one. And so they're going to go through this process, and their demands might be more of a slogan. So we're going to help them in that process. So from the very beginning, I'm helping them think through that. And then I kind of gave some examples on 23, 24, and 25, where they've got this statement of what they think their group is. Like, for example, on 23, sex education. This is actually, less than a year and a half ago. Sex education for a high school district. These 3 students. SJSU improved counseling and mental health services. And then you can see, I say, okay, I want you to name your group. Name your group. So now 24, they named their group, right? They're now Students for Accessible Sexual Health and Services, SASHs. Compassion and Acknowledging Real Life Emotional Hardships, CARE. So now they've gone through a process of thinking around naming, which, by the way, going to your point, Karen, is empowering, right? They've named their group. And now we're at the point of class 6 or 7. I say, okay, take those. Now that we're in those, you've got this new name. How does these ideas, these theoretical ideas around, does change happen through materialism or ideas? What moves history? And I gave them some examples in their groups, their newly named groups, to talk about theory. So all very, on some level, empowering as they're moving through this group, becoming in a group, and now some academic concepts. And again, you could put your academic concepts in there, but I'm kind of just demonstrating to you how I'm moving them step by step, day through day, to a higher level of thinking, but still always connected to their campaign. It's not like it's theoretical only, it's directly connected. It'll give them ideas that'll help move their campaign forward, and they start seeing that. And then those are, by the way, you'll see those questions also in their portfolios. So not only are they talking about it, then they have a chance to write about it too. Any thoughts or questions? Because I think that's kind of fundamental to that section on class 5 and 6 of moving them, but I'm giving examples of how I'm trying to move them.
So Frank, what we're talking about here is the on that part D on the mural board. I think you're on there. So how are you thinking about teaching social change theory, macro, community change at the local level? I haven't read the material, maybe watch the video. You have any thoughts on that? I know you put you on the spot right now, but
Put Frank on the spot.
Yeah, sorry, the juggling 2 things at once here. So yeah, I appreciate the patience and for allowing me to come in late. Yeah, and I think partly what I took away from our last session last week was really trying to galvanize the students around their personal and academic and educational interests, right? And so my courses focuses specifically on race and ethnicity, and more so on the system of racism. So that's kind of what I envision my students working with, engaging with, and really fighting against, is to eradicate racism and racism. You've probably have seen those campaigns or worked with groups that have that as their mission statement. And so I've seen some of that in practice in real time locally, right? And working with some of those orgs. So I'm still trying to kind of think about what that would look like for us, right? Because it's a large kind of piece of the pie to undertake. It's like, well, how do we end racism, right? And it's like, it becomes too big, right? So narrowing that down. And last week I mentioned about the autobiographical sketch. or have them really be like introspective and self-reflective about their own racial identity in relation to the racial hierarchy. And what does that mean for them? And what meaning do they get out of it? And like how those interactions based on their racial makeup really impact their lived reality. And so is that manifested through the school system? Is it manifested through mass incarceration? And often those things, there's a link there too, right? When we think about the prison to pipeline pathway. So that's kind of my thinking in terms of like sparking them to think about their own realities, but then also what kind of campaigns can we do to kind of surround. Yeah, I see your comment there, Scott. Yeah, that's my kind of short-sighted vision for kind of getting them interested in really being effective in terms of what we're doing as a whole. So those are my initial thoughts to your inquiry, Bobby. So appreciate it.
Thank you.
What I wrote to Frank was I can definitely help you on this, and I can help anyone that wants to have that brainstorming. Let's just talk on the phone. But like, for example, like this campaign that the students are running, it could, if the students decided, it could be framed in a racial justice focus, because African Americans are 2 times more likely to be homeless at San Jose State than white students. So it could be, we have the numbers, it could just be totally, so if they wanted to, it could be run that way. And the same thing with students against mass incarceration. They're working against the jail, and it is one of their frames. It's an anti-racist campaign because who's in our jails? Black and brown folks. So I think that, you have that frame, but the question is, how can you choose a policy to change that's you can get at, right? Rather than like end racism. But there are so many, oh my gosh, at San Jose State, it's endless for the lack. I mean, I think I could count the number of Black faculty on my hands of the 1,600 full-time faculty. So there's, I think, huge issues that could be addressed at San Jose State and beyond around that, if that's your frame. And I'm glad to brainstorm, like to take, because I think that's our biggest challenge, how to take this slogans and make it digestible enough to then do something that's concrete and that brings about change that's positive.
Yeah, and just to go off that real quick, in a lot of these campaigns that look at the prison industrial complex, we know that white folks make up a vast majority of those that are incarcerated. People of color are disproportionately represented in the prison system. So the kind of add to what you're saying, Scott, is like, how can we build those multi-racial coalition campaigns, right? And get everyone working towards a common goal. And I think that's key, right? So not so much siloed in terms of our own ethnic groups and our own enclaves, which are important, of course, but also how can we be able to look at that in totality together? That's my $1 million question, I guess.
And by the way, I generally have that universal perspective too when we're organizing, for sure. But I was just giving an example on race, and that's why they also have, like, on that issue, it's in their back pocket. They haven't played that issue yet around, but it's there, and San Jose State is particularly weak on that. So they know they can play that and you drive that, but they've gone for more universal message, all students.
One thing Venice, just nice to see you. I'll give you a quick overview in a second, but one thing that I want to point out is on the mural board, the way the semester goes in Scott's method of teaching it, the scheduling, you're choosing the campaign right away, right? Those are the first 4 classes right there. Then you are, I need to lock it. Then we're now in this section here where we're covering theory of change, building power, those topics. But by week 9, that stuff's done. Scott fills the rest of his semester with analysis of all kinds of campaigns, and you can see those in a couple different places. In a course like yours, Frank, you need some stuff around the theory of change in the beginning to help them frame their campaigns, but you have lots of time to go deeper later, right? So this idea of getting them going, and part of what Scott argues is that they then have a hunger for that information, because now they're starting to confront questions and things like that, and it makes them even more eager to learn it. But so this idea of flipping the order front loading getting the thing started and getting the basics and backfill, not just what we're doing now in terms of understanding how to organize the campaign, but you have this whole other half of the semester to cover lots of other material. Scott, do you want to just speak to that for a second?
Well, I think you did great. For me, I as I said, there are other professors like Miriam Shikow from College of New Jersey. She actually uploads like those first four classes heavy in like around the climate crisis. So just a lot of information around the climate crisis, and then puts them immediately into groups. So, but 4 days of it, and then groups, and then goes back out. So I think but the key thing for me is like, they got to start early if they're doing campaigns, because they'll run out of time for getting something done. I think the other thing I would say is the book, and it's represented in today's reading, there's a balance between action and reflection. If you just continually ask your students to act without giving them time to breathe, it's too overwhelming. Just as you were talking about, Bobby, about the challenges like doing this, the students will be just overwhelmed. If you say, okay, I want you to do this action, I want you to do this action. So as you notice in the change theory, after they're getting into solidifying their demands and their targets, they're doing change theory. So they're not doing anything for 2 days other than they're solidifying their demands and targets. Then when we do building power, there's that section is still that's on the conceptual level the first day, and then the second day, class 8, I asked them to do something, take their building powers, like the idea of power, and say, how do you get it? Well, let's start getting some power. So that's when we start talking the organizational wrap, the sheet they've got to design. They start talking about doing campus, the interviews of students. So there's this definitely action outward. And again, that's designed to not overwhelm the students. So there's this balance between doing stuff, talk, and then reflecting on, thinking about it, and doing back and forth. And that's, to me, I hope it's the best of kind of Ferrerian practice of theory and praxis. Because if you just do one or the other, it burns the students out, particularly too much action. So it's designed that way. And you'll see that just in the reading, like page 29, I say this, and it's kind of demystifying power. Just want to highlight it. Chapter 8 starts by focusing on the practical details of how groups can build power. And I give them the 4 right there. You create a group willing to fight for demands. They've already done that. They're like, woo, we've done 1. 2, you find more people. You recruit. So they begin recruiting, tabling right then. The tables are in my office. I start going out tabling. 3, they build campus and community allies. That's where the stakeholder interview begins to take place. And they start looking around campus, who can support them. And 4, build knowledge and skills. And that's there for the next class, because the next class, we're going to be talking about research. So they've got to have more knowledge. And so I put it in there. They're going to have to build their knowledge and skills, but because really they're going to know more about this issue than the president or the provost or the city council member. I tell them that they're going to know more, and at the end of it, and that's power, as I talked about in that going back to that Stephen Biko quote. And most of my students have no idea who Stephen Biko is. There's a great movie, Cry Freedom, about it. So I tell them to watch it. But that quote about the mind of the oppressed, that quote is really important for the students about power. So I would say highlight that quote by Biko that's in the book, and talk about they're going to have the knowledge to overcome oppression.
Well, let's use that as just into this. Denise, I'll cover some stuff. Maybe if you stay on a few minutes at the end, I can cover the opening piece. But we just finished talking about sort of change theory. We're shifting into the second part, which is getting the students to start build power. It begins with recruiting other students, identifies some allies. And those of you who've begun to think about that, what concepts will you use to help define power for your students? And then there's the steps of building it. I put some of the steps here. I just outlined them as these 2 little, the recruitment committee and kind of what they're meant to design, and then the recruitment plan of doing presentations and tabling and flyering.
And I would just say, Bobby, like there's a huge burst of activity right then, and that's going to take them for the next 10 days. All those things, right? And they divide them up. I have them divide up all that work, because different people can do different things. But in the next 2 weeks, they're going to have an incredible amount of action accomplished by doing those things that are listed out.
So the question is, how are you guys thinking about the question of getting your students to both understand power and think about power, and then the recruiting part, building power? Should I call on somebody? Benice, you almost leaned forward. Am I saying your name right? I keep thinking I'm not saying it quite right.
Yes, you are.
Okay.
You're saying it perfect.
Benice. Oh, Benice, what do you have to add? I'm sure you have something great to say.
So your question was, how will I teach building power?
Yeah, well, even beginning with how you define it, how you might help the students define power. Part of what Scott talks about is students shy away, some students anyway, shy away from the concept and think it's a bad thing.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think it's contextual too. In my class, we talk about deconstructing power. So it's kind of, I guess, switching that light of how can we use power positively, because we're always looking at the negative power in the field of education. So what does that look like when we can use our power and privilege as teacher leaders, as students at San Jose State? How can we use that for progress? I think would be a way. And then, of course, the ways in which Scott talked about in that section.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Who else wants to add something to this?
You want to add, Rosa, about people power?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important for students to learn how to, if they're not doing it already. I think especially now that you have Facebook, you have a lot of social media tools where young people are already, they're connected, they have networks, and they can draw on those networks to create people power. They can build alliances with other student groups. They can identify other allies on the campus or in the community that they can work with. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities for students to really build a coalition, to not feel that they are doing this alone. I think is a really important lesson. If the most effective community organizers that I've met in my career know how to build coalitions, diverse coalitions of different, that they're organized around a particular issue, but they're very diverse, and they're very broad, and they're very deep. So
Thank you.
And
I
think-
had
oh,
an idea for my course. I want to develop a different model. I like the models presented, and I'll compare those models, but I want to develop a science-based, social science expert model of change and power. So what's the role, since that's what my course emphasizes, the role of the social scientists in changing policy. And so that's my model that I want to develop for power and change.
And Stephen, would that be knowledge power?
Yes, like evidence-based knowledge power. Yes.
Yeah.
And that's what the course is about. And so that's why I think this is social action would be perfect to build a social action component so they can apply that knowledge model. Like the minimum wage, the change in the new law in San Jose. What are the social science effects, the sociological, psychological effects of not having a minimum wage? Presenting that evidence is used to achieve power.
I agree with you. I think that's and part of the next section is about the research to back up your argument.
Good.
And it seems like there's we just look at how people politically have responded to COVID, whether science is actually valued or not. So there's real hurdles to kind of just having a valid answer isn't necessarily going to be enough. That's part of what you're going to wrestle with, right? In your discussion with folks.
Science and the scientists and the anti-science and how this process occurs. See, my course is currently emphasizing social scientists who testify before governmental agencies, local, state, federal. like testify before Congress on policy changes. All kinds, economists, psychologists, sociologists,
Yeah.
criminologists,
Yeah.
psychologists. So it's that model hasn't been developed very much, I don't think, for this type of course.
Yeah, interesting. Who else
And
to add?
compare it to these other models, this knowledge model.
And it may not be a both, it may be a both and as opposed to either or.
Right.
Right. In other words, you have to have the scientific argument, but you still got to get people to listen to it. And there may be other ways you have to leverage
Exactly.
folks behind it. In terms of the, just to move to for a second, in terms of the actual, the initial recruiting phase of this, were there any questions around that? The flyering, the sign-up sheets, the kind of the nuts and boltsy kind of stuff?
And also just the idea of the like building allies in the community. Because when I started, I knew nobody really. I didn't know who the, maybe I don't know the mayor maybe, but I didn't know really who the city council member was. Or now I know every one of them, right? So all of that, like who the heads of all. I mean, seriously, then, and which is extremely helpful, by the way, to help our students get jobs, because I now know all the heads of all the major nonprofits. Because eventually, my students have worked with many of them. So like, yeah, I'm 17 or how many years, 16, 17 years in. But when I started, I knew nothing. So I had to start like, who's the head of the labor council? Like, let's go meet them. So I went out and started making phone calls and talking with folks because I didn't know anybody. So I think you got to, the faculty member, rather than where there has to be that emphasis of having some knowledge of the community to know, like, because they'll say, well, stakeholder interview, who do I interview? And you're like, well, you should talk to this faith leader, talk to this rabbi. I know that they're interested in this. Or so you have to be kind of a resource for them. And while in the beginning you won't have much of that, you will develop that. And you have to kind of be patient with yourself too, but at least start that process.
Scott, speaking of patience, you said a couple of times in the book and in the highlight video that students haven't necessarily done a lot of work at a certain stage in this, right? And that portfolio and the logs help you see that and you get on them. The research section is coming up, but where they've already developed their wrap, they've already got an idea of the target and their demands. Do you sometimes get in a situation where their demands and their analysis of the situation isn't very well informed and in a sense isn't even totally accurate? I don't know what degree to emphasize that part of it, but in other words, they're not really ready and they don't necessarily have a good argument. They haven't really pulled the facts together. And yet, I mean, how do you handle that situation? Do you let them just fall flat on their face? They start
No. So
tabling and
I'm grading their portfolios right now. So it's in my head, like 5. Now, how I've gotten better about it was that my questions for my portfolio have gotten better. So like, for example, include 5 citations with scholarship on the social problem. So like that guarantees they've got to go into the research letter and get out. And some of them have done that and some of them haven't. And I'm like, okay, you didn't do it. So your grade is a D or a C. But now for your portfolio, for your last portfolio, your campaign notebook, I'm going to give you another chance. And you can improve it for that and I will raise your grade. So I'm always hoping for the best. Some students don't do a very good job, but and aren't as well prepared. And here's the thing, if they're not as well prepared, they'll know it because reality will teach them. And so, I mean, sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. And here's even when they are prepared, I just got on a phone call of a student that's going to be interviewed by National Public Radio and on this student homeless crisis. And she's like, I'm so nervous. I'm like, you're well prepared though. You're your stuff. Yeah. So the students, I mean, I think that's just part of the process. So you have to be engaged with them. You can't just like wish them good luck, but you have to structure the class that gives them the opportunity to have a comeback, a second chance.
Well, yeah, and I'm getting at the situation where they're starting to table.
Yep.
They may not get to the point of doing a press conference.
Yep.
But they're tabling, they're going out, and they don't have the backup at that stage. How do you handle that?
Well, I'll give you an example. A student group just met with the supervisor about the jail. And her response was they're a nice group, naive. And I wanted to say what she's saying is they don't know fully the history. And so I told them that. And I said, you have to go deeper dive. You have to know more. And they have. So they won't be as green. But I also want to say the supervisor, give them a break. They're like, they met with them early, because I also say meet with your target early. So they learn. So it's just like, I think that's just part of the process. It's just they learn, and they learn that they have to be, if they're gonna, and they realize that if they have the knowledge, that gets them movement. So do all students do it? No. But do all students get A's in our classes? No. But I guarantee they will see, like, this group that's done their research and are really well prepared. That will then inspire the others. It already has. The other students are trying harder right now because they see movement.
Yeah. Let me just ask if there's any questions or comments now. We're almost at 4:45, and I want to end on time, although I invite Frank and Venice to stay a little longer just so I can cover our very opening suggestion in terms of the resource template. Any questions or comments?
I would say this, one thing I want to say before the questions, that please invite me, like, Venice, I'm going to go into her class and help with some of these questions. And I'm glad to do that through Zoom or any other way to help, because I think that's my role, is to kind of help the students and Frank, you too, like, to help them process and to get the demands and any other questions. So I'm just always available. But yeah, I want to hear any last thoughts or questions or thoughts about what we talked about.
I'm sorry, this is just a resource question. I noticed when you were sharing your screen, and I think it was from the mural, you had a section that was called Social Action Docs, and you could look at the examples. I went on the mural and I'm sorry, I couldn't find it.
Yeah,
Can
okay.
you show us where those docs are, or just tell us if they're on the Bonner page, or are they in the mural?
I will put them on the mural. They're on the I'll do a quick screen share. They are in the webinar series. There's that opening overview and webinar resources.
Okay.
Material. It's there. It's the last section of I've added to the section where we have course design questions and syllabus and course planning template. It's on that page now. And I'll add it to the mural board. I didn't think to add it there, but that's actually a smart place to put it as well.
Thank you.